Hey everybody, welcome to our synthesis review video, part 2. In the previous video we went over the hook, background, and thesis, and the first body paragraph, and we made it through almost all of the elements of our tracker except for the concluding statement. So in these last two paragraphs of the essay, we're just going to be seeing the student reusing these good tools and tactics that we've already discussed. For instance, at the beginning of their next body paragraph, they write, "Why should we consider people's welfare when commissioning a statue or monument's development?" So this sentence directly transitions from the previous paragraph. In the last paragraph, it ends with, "When commissioning and creating a statue or memorial, the people affected by the structure must be first and foremost considered." That's what this paragraph has proven. This paragraph is then going to deal with why we should consider people's welfare. What are the negative outcomes if we don't? And so we see a clear connection where it's transitioning to show how this paragraph is going to build upon this paragraph. And I'll restate it one more time for clarity. So while this paragraph talks about how statues can be problematic and concludes that we must consider how these problematic statues and memorials will affect people, this paragraph now talks about why what's been proven is important. Okay, so it's building. Next, the student writes, "It is due to the purpose of these monuments to build community." So this does two things. One, this is the clear topic sentence. This paragraph is going to be about building communities, or how the purpose of the monument is going to build communities. And then you'll see the topic sentence continues here. "On the most practical level, if the surrounding community is offended or hurt by the memorials, then people will simply not visit." So when you look at these two sentences together as the topic sentence, what we see is that it's going to talk about how community is important, but more specifically, it's going to talk about how, if community isn't put as the most important consideration for a monument's development, it's going to result in not only hurting the community, but hurting the memorial itself. So that's what this paragraph is going to prove. Also note the really cool style where it's using the colon. And let's continue forward. So then we have our transition. It says, "For instance," so we're moving from our topic sentence to our evidence. So again, we have our internal transitioning. And then the student writes, "The Savannah Memorial Park, where San Gabriel pioneers are buried, may have to move due to poor community support and even poorer funding," source D. "While the thought of moving the 3,000 graves may seem appalling to some, the surrounding community of Asian businesses and residents find the graveyard to be bad luck," source D. So here, remember before we talked about the different ways to pair sources, here the student is building sources from the same source in order to show that they can pull exactly the information that they need. Now, it's okay to do this on its own in one paragraph, but remember, in the majority of your paragraphs, you should be pulling from two sources to show true synthesis. So here they have their evidence, and then they write, "This cultural difference is a reality, and therefore the graveyard receives no support from its community and now only has enough funding to remain open for 2 more years. The conflict is an unfortunate one, as in 1847 no one could have known that it was going to be a problematic place to bury people. However, if there's no money to maintain the property, then the property must be moved." So the student makes a pretty pragmatic point that this graveyard's incredibly old, and so people had no idea that the community was going to change and that the graveyard would become offensive to the new community. But that's the reality. The new community surrounding this graveyard are offended by the graveyard. And therefore, the graveyard ultimately is going to most likely be moved, because if there's no community support, then it simply isn't going to stay open. And so it points out the idea that community support is important to the survival of the statue or memorial or monument. Next, the student then puts "therefore," which is a transition, and then it goes into "topic and location are the most important considerations when attempting to use a memorial as a community center." So again, we have a really good transition here. So it's proven that topic is important. You don't want to have an offensive topic. And then it also says you don't want to have an offensive location. You want to please the people who surround the monument or memorial. And therefore, it's taking the two things that have been proven and stating that these are the most important things to consider when developing a memorial. And this goes directly back to what was requested by the synthesis prompt, as it asks us what we should consider when agencies develop memorials. And so it's staying on topic. Then the student writes, if the memorial appeals to the beliefs of the surrounding community, it will thrive due to that community support. So here we have a very clear statement of proof, aka a very clear topic sentence. We know what this paragraph is going to prove. It's going to prove that community support helps a memorial thrive. However, the community itself also benefits from this symbiotic relationship. So really good phrasing, symbiotic relationship. It's a good analogy. But it's very clear what we are going to be persuaded to believe by this author. So next, the author writes, as Kirk Savage explained, so we have a transition as we're going from the topic sentence to the evidence, as Kirk Savage explains. Again, this is also a tag phrase as it provides the author's name before proceeding into the evidence. Using the Lincoln Memorial as his example, so it provides more context, which is very important for the quote, because we want to know not only who's talking, but what he's, writing about. The monument creates an actual or temporary community of readers who must obey a particular decorum. Everything about the experience marks it as extraordinary and authoritative. Source A. Note how the author uses an ellipses here so that they don't have to use the entire quote. A couple of you guys had quotes that were like 5 lines long. That's so much copying, and it's not the best use of your time. They're not grading you based upon how well you can copy a quote. They're grading you based upon how well you write your own personal arguments. Therefore, you want to have your quotes be as succinct as possible. And note how this is the only full quote that the student uses. So remember that I mentioned that you should primarily have paraphrasing and then a couple breakout quotes and no more than one full quote. This is the student's one full quote. And then, of course, they have their in-text citation. A monument can take individuals and turn them into a collective body. This is an example of a breakout quote from the same source, and they're using it to further clarify what Kirk Savage means in this quote. This, too, transitioning to their next piece of evidence, is why the Vietnam Memorial is so successful, as it's a beautiful construction that fits naturally into the setting and seeks to create a unity between the nation's past and present. So here they show how source A and source G has a common purpose, which is to point out how statues and memorials and monuments should focus on unity of a community. You'll note that the sources are pretty densely packed here. There's not a lot of elaboration. It's quite clearly because the student was running out of time and they knew they had to move on to their next essay. So keep that in mind, that if you rush a little at the end, try to maintain the quality of like your style, but if you need to just kind of shove those final sources in there so that you can get all your information in, you won't necessarily lose points. And then they write, this sense of community and unity, taking the community from here and the unity from here. So they're summarizing what the two pieces of evidence that have been in this paragraph. Community and unity is what we need from our statues and our memorials and our monuments. So they use polysyndeton here, and it kind of makes sense because you could kind of see this coming where they've been talking about statues and memorials and monuments over and over again, and I feel as though probably what they're pointing out is that they've used those words a lot, so they might be kind of be making fun of their own writing actually, but it's a really good use of polysyndeton. And it writes, instead of reminders of division, we need symbols that remind us of just how much we have in common and the common feature we must work together to achieve. So this is the concluding statement, which is the very last row in your tracker. So I've talked to you guys about how you don't need to have a conclusion paragraph. A lot of you guys are still writing conclusion paragraphs and you're falling into the reason why you shouldn't. Your conclusion paragraphs are 1 to 2 sentences that don't add anything special to the style or to the content of your essay. It's just there because you think it should be. If you have a conclusion like that just throws away 2 sentences, it will lower your score. So if you really are married to the idea of having a conclusion, it needs to be an amazing conclusion. If you're just going to write 2 sentences of summary, just don't do it. Instead, dedicate that time to having a much better final body paragraph. However, if you don't have a conclusion, you do need to have a concluding statement at the end of your last paragraph. And that needs to be one that not only wraps up the paragraph itself, but wraps up the whole essay. So here we see when it says this sense of community and unity, that is transitioning from what's been proven through this evidence and the analysis of that evidence here. But then it says that's what we need from our statues and memorials and our monuments. That goes back all the way up here, I believe, to their question. In the face of this tension, what is the responsibility of groups and agencies that are commissioning new statues and monuments? So it asks the question and it returns to that question here. It is their responsibility to, instead of reminding us of our divisions, it's to provide symbols of what we have in common and what we can work together to achieve. So, again, such great cohesive writing in this paragraph. It's very complete for a first draft that they wrote in 50 minutes probably. And so, again, in the intro, it says, while these statues and monuments cannot heal divisions in our country, they can be a symbolic start. We see that phrasing return here, where they say, instead of reminders of divisions, we need symbols. So we can see that the students return to their thesis, but instead of just restating the thesis, which again is just going to throw away a sentence because it's something you've already written, they use the thesis to show what we have learned from reading their essay. We've learned that instead of these divisions that the essay opened up focusing on, we need symbols to remind us of just how much we have in common and the common feature we must work together to achieve. And so this goes into their larger argument as to, because remember the larger argument they asked about was there is no dispute that these statues are further exposed to much deeper tension. They talk about that tension here and ultimately how new monuments can help as a starting point to ease those tensions. And so the ending's a little cheesy. It is. It's very positive and it's very idealistic. But don't be scared to be idealistic in these essays. It's a really easy way to get a really conclusive finish, to kind of have this like idealistic end. And it will give you that conclusive feel. Again, if you're a real pessimist, then go for a really pessimistic conclusion. But make sure that you have a concluding statement that not only wraps up your final body paragraph, but the essay as a whole, returning back to the thesis and showing us what we've learned about that thesis. All right, I am done. This is the end of part 2 for your sample synthesis essay. So now, if you haven't already done so, complete your essay tracker so that you can plan for how you're going to take the synthesis essay you just received back from writing last week and how you're going to make your next synthesis essay even better. Thanks so much, guys, and have a great night. Bye.